Great. Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for our shipping and logistics call with LJM. We've had a couple of calls with LJM in the past with Thomas and Kenneth, and so some of you that have done these before with us may recognize them. But with us, we're really happy to have Thomas Anderson, who's one of the partners and a VP of Supply Chain Services, and Kenneth Moyer, who is also a partner and VP of Supply Chain Strategies, obviously both with LJM Group. And the timing of this call, I think, couldn't be better. Today might actually be the cutoff for a lot of retailers if you want to make sure to get packages by Christmas, but we'll get into that in a minute. But maybe before we start, Kenneth, do you want to share a quick comment about the firm and what LJM does for those that don't know, and then I'll get into the questions.
Sure. Just for those of you who may not be familiar with us, at LJM Group, we really specialize in the small parcel space. Almost everyone on staff has come from one of the small parcel carriers, and we focus on cost mitigation through a few strategies. One is an invoice audit to make sure that invoices are being applied properly by the carriers. We also help with contract negotiations to make sure that your carrier contracts are in line with the market, and then also just supply chain improvements. So we look at areas of inefficiency or that may be lagging best practices in the market, and we help our customers bring those up to speed. So we try to improve their supply chain and reduce the cost during the process of that.
That's great. Thank you. And yeah, I'm sure you guys are quite busy this year. It's a lot going on. So maybe with that, to actually, Kenneth, we'll just start with you. Maybe can you remind us of, I guess, how things have been impacted by COVID this year, and maybe some of the bigger themes or trends you've seen and changes that might actually stick well after COVID is cleared through?
Sure, absolutely, and of course, there's a lot to unpack in that. It's
Yeah.
been a year of some pretty rapid evolution, but obviously there has been some dramatic changes in the past year. We've probably seen the acceleration of the online adoption curve by 6 to 8 years just in the past 10 or 11 months. And that's created, a lot of challenges in the market, a lot of seismic shifts that normally would have taken 5, 6, 7, 8 years to play out over the course of a few months. I mean, we've seen online sales spending go up almost 33% over the first 3 quarters of the year, which is obviously a pretty dramatic change. So that's created some unique challenges in different areas. So we'll talk about a few things. One is carrier capacity, right? Because all these packages have to move with someone. So it's really put a lot of stress and strain on the carrier capacity, right? Their buildings are full, their trucks are full, and they've really struggled with how to handle that additional volume. Now they've been really aggressive in doing what they can as far as hiring more employees, adding vehicles, but some of those changes, the infrastructure investments, the buildings, those obviously take longer to come to fruition and really pay a benefit, right? So we really see some capacity constraints, even to the point where the carriers are going to some very large shippers and capping what they're allowed to ship. So going to them and saying, you can't give us any more packages than you gave us last year, or hey, you can only give us 12 trailers a day, even if you want to give us 15 trailers a day. So capacity has been at the forefront of almost everybody's mind. And it really is limited, which is creating some other challenges to get through. So one is pricing, right? So the capacity constraints create a unique pricing environment. So we're in the midst of a real carrier's market, right? They have full trucks, full buildings. So their focus can be entirely on yield instead of market growth, because they have all the packages they want. So it's creating a very difficult pricing environment. It's a difficult environment to negotiate in. And we've even seen instances where large shippers that had good contracts, where the carriers are actually going back to them and asking for price. Well, it's not really an ask. They're securing price concessions during this time. And they simply can, just because the demand is there. So those have really been, I think, the major themes: capacity constraints and cost increases have really been significant.
Got it. Got it. So maybe, Thomas, maybe we can get into the capacity issues a little bit. Like, tell us how unit shipments have trended over the past few months, and maybe, how does that compare to last year? We keep hearing it's been like, Christmas for 8, 9 months now. Help us kind of understand what's going on with the shipment
Yeah,
trend.
there's some truth to that. So what we experienced really at the beginning of the year, and let's go into Q2, was um, historically we see e-commerce, online e-commerce shipments accounting for about 11% of total retail. So that would be 2019, and the prior year was closer to 10%. So we're seeing this sort of 1% increase, which is a net impact of, let's call it 10%. Suddenly in Q2, we see that number jump to 16% plus. So for all purposes, that's about a 50% increase because at that point, everything was shut down, literally shut down.
Right.
Then the restrictions eased up a little bit. So we get into Q3 and that number drops, for all purposes, drops to 14% and change, which is still a significant amount over the anticipated 11%. So we're seeing this sort of 30 to 35% increase in e-commerce volume as a result of this. And of course, the foot traffic into stores is slowing down. So that's really what we see in terms of that volume spiking at that point.
Got it. Got it. So, it's understandable. I guess maybe Kenneth, let's go back to the capacity issue, and sort of it relates to what Thomas just said about shipments. You can't just throw, I guess, bodies at it. Like, you still need the trucks and you still need the other parts of the supply chain or the logistics chain to get the product to the customer. So how can these guys do it? I mean, like you said, we've heard cutoffs at some retailers. They've been told, hey, we can't take all your goods. What happens? Is it?
Yeah, well, that's I bet they'd like the answer to that too.
Yeah.
So there are some variable things that they can improve, like we talked about. They've added a lot of labor. Trucks are actually, in fact, go try to rent a U-Haul truck or a Ryder truck right now. You won't find them because UPS and FedEx have all of them. All the major carriers have added aircraft this year. It's really the building capacity is where they're struggling the most, and trained staff. So it's one thing to add someone that jumps for a driver. It's something else to make someone a commercial driver in a few weeks. So that's where their struggle is. Now, what we found is the shippers and the retailers that already had the most flexibility built in, and really have a culture of flexibility, and that were already up in the e-commerce curve. Those folks have handled this as well as can be expected. And I know we'll probably get into some of these topics a little later, but multiple avenues, picking up in stores, curbside delivery, ship from stores. The more flexible a shipper has been, the more avenues they have, the more they've been able to adapt and adjust to this and be hurt less. It's the ones that had a more rigid supply chain, one or two distribution centers, not a lot of other avenues out to the customers. They're the ones that the supply chain is really struggling.
Got it. As you think, I don't know if you can share names, but like, are there some retailers or maybe industry groups that do it better? I'm thinking like Walmart, Target have everything you just described. They're very flexible. Are there others like that can handle the shipping capacity constraints better than others?
Yeah.
Thomas, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think the perfect example is a Target, and obviously they didn't prepare for this, but things that they had in place have really allowed for their network to operate very effectively. Now they benefit from being a critical source in the first place. So it's a place where people can get the essential needs that they require. But then they also had the buy online, pick up in store that was already very effective. You walk in, it's right there, versus the historical going back now 5+ years. Walmart used to place this all the way in the back of the store. Um, but both companies now place that in the front of the store to make it convenient. Then you have the curbside pickup, which again, designated parking spots where people can go. But what Target was able to do was they made the acquisition of Shipped, and now and that's really a direct, when you wanted to differentiate with Amazon, where again it's a 2-day delivery model, it was a couple years ago. In order to compete with that, now you're getting that local delivery in a matter of a couple hours, and that's what allowed them to differentiate. But I think it was in full anticipation that Amazon is going to end up there one day, and I think that's going to be here in the next year or two, pretty consistently. So I think Target is a perfect example of buy online, pick up in store, the curbside pickup, the local delivery. You can have something delivered in an hour or two. And then, of course, basically the Target store becomes almost a fulfillment center. It's not your, yes, people are still going to go there and shop and so forth, but it's probably, look, I'm going to take a look at that TV, see if it works right, and then I'm going to go back and order it and have it delivered, or, some of those things. I think that's where we're going. And I think Target has done that much more effectively than really anyone else. And I'm not dismissing certainly a Walmart, but Walmart has been operating very effectively already, but I think Target has really done this better than most. One other one that stands out, and I think they're benefiting from, again, a time where people can't travel. They're sitting around their house. They're realizing, look, there's projects to get done and so forth. So you have the Home Depot and the Lowe's, far less effective supply chain in the sense that, the buy online, pick up in store, the curbside, the delivery model, it's definitely not as robust as Target. But I think they're benefiting from the fact that people want to get things done. They don't feel as comfortable having people in their house doing these things for them. So the home improvement side has grown so substantially over this time that they are another one that's really is benefiting, in that space. And it doesn't have to just be Home Depot and Lowe's, but also, other hardware type stores and so forth, if they have the proper supply chain in place, as Kenneth mentioned earlier.
So I'm sorry to jump around a little bit and go off script, but based on what you guys are saying right now, and I don't know if this is more Thomas or Kenneth, but how are you guys advising, like, say, Lowe's or Home Depot, who need to, and we on the retail side think of them as better than most other retailers, even though they're not where they could be. Like, what are things, and maybe not Home Depot, Lowe's per se, but what are things that you guys see that are the biggest holes in the company? Is it that they don't have great inventory management system, or where do they need to get better to do, shipping and be more flexible, BOPUS, all the things you're talking about? I don't know which one of you guys is better to start with that, but sorry. Maybe Kenneth, if you want to.
I'll defer to Kenneth, and then I can.
Okay. So
Yeah. Sure. And I really kind of think it goes back to creating flexibility in the supply chain. So the folks that we're seeing hit the most, both by the capacity constraints from the carriers, and then also inventory management and sourcing inventory as well, are those exceptionally large retailers and only have 1 or 2 distribution centers, and they only have 1 or 2 channels to their customers, right? So if they were strictly online retailer or strictly brick and mortar retailer, having 1 or 2 distribution centers really creates additional links in the supply chain, all of which can cause delays. They are the ones that put the greatest strain on the carrier capacity, because all of that volume is coming out of 1 or 2 locations. So it will swamp, especially if it's in a geographic location where there's other large shippers. So like we're seeing probably the most struggles we're having is in California right now. So the carriers' buildings are over capacity. There's a large number of large shippers there, which puts more strain on the capacity. And especially if they're shipping to the East Coast, there's a lot of links in that supply chain. So the more flexibility, so if you have product in more places, right? So if you have multiple DCs or or partnerships with 3PLs, or if you have brick and mortar that you can ship from. Spreading that inventory out helps, because now the supply chain between the order and the customer is shortened, right? It's not going cross country. It might just be going across town. It also spreads your inventory out. So if you run out of inventory in one place, a lot of times it can be supplemented from another. And then also having multiple places to source inventory from also helps. We saw all the factory shutdowns earlier this year. If you're relying on one place to get your product from, that can really be a problem. So having those multiple avenues. So as Thomas mentioned, if you have brick and mortar and you can do curbside pickup or ship from store, that gives you 2 different channels. And potentially if your store is open, that gives you 3 different channels, all to address whatever your customers are comfortable with. And it relieves the pressure on any one channel, right? So if you're providing curbside pickup and where people can buy in store, that's fewer packages in the supply chain. If people can't come to the store and you're shipping it, again, that takes pressure off other legs of the supply chain. So the more elements to the supply chain you have, the more flexibility. Those are the folks that they're going to fare a lot better than if they have a single channel, a single distribution center.
Okay, that's
And
helpful.
if I can just add a couple things, I would also address the multi-carrier model, where, again, going back to California presence, you have On Track, that's a great regional carrier there. You also have GSO. So, and then in other parts of the country, you have some other ones as well. So that's a model. And then, of course, going back to the brick and mortar, what's great about having if you have a presence with locations throughout the US, utilizing these local delivery services, where, again, I'll use Shipt because we already discussed that, where you have local sort of Uber type delivery people that are able to utilize their own resources. You get it for certainly much lower cost than you would with a global carrier, because the global carriers are not really designed to offer a reasonable solution for local delivery. And when you can benefit from some of those things, I think that's where you are ahead of the curve. And the challenge there, which you asked, is really how do you build the technology to allow for all of this to happen? And I think that's probably the biggest constraint that we have. Is not that people don't want to change. It's simply that, in order for us to do this with our 150,000 SKUs and choosing whether this shipment should come out of location A or B or from a fulfillment center, those are some of the real challenges that I think we encounter the most.
Got it. That's helpful. Before I keep forgetting, for everybody listening, if you do have questions and you wanted to ask, you can, raise your hand through the Zoom, or it's probably easier and more direct if you want to just email me at jfeldman@telsigroup.com, and then I can ask a question, or send it to tagevents@telsigroup.com. Either one will work, and we'll make sure to get the question asked. So, Kenneth, I wanted to ask, again, based off the capacity constraints we've seen, where does the average order cutoff stand right now to get it, say, to get a gift to the house by Christmas? We're hearing and we're seeing, it's like yesterday and today have actually been cutoffs. I think, one of the guys on our team sent around an email or a screenshot of H&M's website. It says, today's the day. If you want it by Christmas, your cutoff's now. So what are you guys, what is realistic though? Is it really this weekend is the end?
Yeah, and that's a good question, and I think some of that may be true. I do think, just my opinion, is some of that is posturing to try to, and you have to forgive the pun, but flatten the curve out on the order volume, right? Because if you tell people they have to order earlier, they're more likely to do it, and so that way it spreads that holiday season out a little bit more. So instead of waiting to the last minute, folks are going to order a little bit earlier. So I think there's some of that posturing going on. But I think a lot of it depends too on, again, I'm going to go back to the inventory staging question that we talked about earlier. I think if you're talking about a Target or a Best Buy that has inventory spread out through the country, they're going to have a longer, you're going to be able to order later and still get your goods. If you're talking about a single distribution center or one or two sourcing areas, I think today, or this week could very well be the cutoff. We're already starting to see some carrier delays, but I don't think a carrier delay would cause that whole span. But if you're talking about having to pick, pack, and ship it from a single location, and that's cross country, you may very well run into that. I think the other thing that we're going to see in the next few days go away is economy shipping options that make it by Christmas. So you still may be able to order later and get your product by Christmas, but you're going to have to pay a premium in order to upgrade a service, versus using a more economy or free shipping that might go through the post office or one of the delayed services through UPS or FedEx. So I think if you're looking for free or cheap delivery to get it by Christmas, I would say the next few days are probably your window.
Understood. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, because that was sort of my next question. You kind of answered it, but I was going to ask Thomas about, from the carrier standpoint, do they have the capacity, if I want to pay an extra $10 for the item to get it there by Christmas, they'll make that happen. Can they do that, Thomas? I mean, is there?
To a certain extent, but so each of the carriers have posted what they considered the latest delivery date. And I believe with UPS, it's maybe the 16th for a ground shipment. That may have changed since I looked at it last. But what's interesting is when you looked at next day and 2-day, it was still maybe the 19th or so. So it was a date that certainly wouldn't be next day or 2-day. Now, what I do think is, like Kenneth mentioned, some of this is even on the carrier side is putting the message out there. Look, we want this to be, we want additional time to get this delivered to you. Already the money back guarantees, the service guarantees are already gone. They've been gone since the entire pandemic period, really. And then historically, that's gone during the holiday season anyway. So they don't have a commitment per se to get it to you. But of course, there's the perception and the you're still gonna have frustrated when little Johnny doesn't get his toy on Christmas morning and so forth. So they want to do whatever they can to make sure that gets delivered on time. I would certainly not get into the latter part of, let's say, the week after next and expect to have something delivered on time. But I do think they have the ability to sort of pick and choose, because there are going to be major capacity constraints. Some packages are simply going to get held up. Just to put some numbers around it, in September, the average daily volume was around, I think it was $80 million shipments between UPS, FedEx, and USPS. And in December, it'll be about 120 million. And that's already, that 80 million year over year is already an extreme increase. So it's just this massive amount of volume that's going through a network that has been built to in anticipation of sort of a let's call it a 5 to 10% increase year over year. Now suddenly there's this 30% increase, and it has not been designed for that. So you can pick up the U-Haul trucks, you can hire temporary employees, you can do those things, but the infrastructure is there. And by the time you invest in more infrastructure, this thing will, not that it's going to die out, but then it'll get a little bit more normal again, and now you're going to be sitting on extra capacity. So there's really no purpose for them to go to that extent. Instead, what they're doing is trying to put to some extent the burden on the shipper by increasing their rates, adding new fees, really a lot of capacity constraints for large shippers. I think Nike's in that group, and a lot of other ones that we've dealt with. So basically, I mean, that's the challenge that you're dealing with.
Got it. That's helpful. So we had a couple of questions come in so far, and one is exactly what you just said, Thomas. So maybe I'll stay with you on this. What does Nike do if they're cut off?
Yeah.
How do they handle that?
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I don't know how they truly handle that. I mean, we haven't dealt with Nike, but we've dealt with others that are certainly large enough. And the reality is, in this particular case, they're with UPS. They reach out to FedEx. FedEx says, "Wish we could help you. Come mid-January, we can talk again." But right now, we're at capacity.
Okay.
So we can't do anything for you. In their particular market, there are no regional carriers. And the notice that was given to them, this was not something where you plan for your typical peak periods. It's more of maybe a month, 4 or 6 weeks ago, they were informed, hey, come December, these are your daily limits coming out of here. And you know, it's 100,000 shipments on this day, it's 50,000 on another day, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's very specific, and your hands really are tied. And the question is, how do you sell around that concept? And it's a real challenge. So to a large degree, I mean, we're dealing with just, you know, it's almost like when you go back to where we were in March and April when we were told, hey, look, we're not going to ever have toilet paper again, and no more Lysol wipes and so forth. It's sort of the same thing here. Hey, look, we just don't have space for you to move your product. We're not going to shut you off, obviously, but we are limiting your volume, and it's really up to you to work around that constraint.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Just, I know we have a question from Will DeMuth. Can you maybe open up the line, Nicole, so Will can ask?
The line's open. Well, you just turn your mute off?
Yeah, Will, you're on mute.
Okay.
Still on mute, Will. All right, well, in the meantime, there's another question that did come in online. We'll get to Will in a minute then. How amenable has UPS been to honoring discounts rates that were achieved last year through negotiations? They were saying if I guess there were some discounts given if they reduced shipping volumes by a little bit, maybe last year. I'm not 100% sure, but the specific question is, how amenable has UPS been to honoring discount rates achieved in the prior year for 70% reduced shipping volumes? How do we freeze the, rules tariff within UPS and or FedEx?
So I can tackle this one. So UPS, both carriers, but since this question is specific to UPS, UPS implemented what they call rate freeze, which I should say automatically occurred, but it didn't quite automatically occur. Once we got into April, and a lot of volume dropped for many shippers. So if you were in, something, just one that comes to mind is wedding gowns, for example. Everything got canceled. You're no longer shipping, but you may have the random shipment here and there. What UPS did was they went back to, I think it was March 7th, the portfolio tier structure that you had in place as of March 7th, which is now portfolio tier is what basically basically provides or explains what discounts you're getting based on your qualifier. So what they did is they basically froze your discounts based on that in a positive way. If the volume increased, you could certainly get unfrozen, but it basically froze the pricing for the large majority of shippers that are out there. The question really has become, when are they going to unfreeze, because they don't want to do this, evergreen. They don't want to go 2 years into this thing and do so. So the reality is we're just now starting to see them unfreeze. And it's interesting how they're going about doing it. Some reps are I would call entirely unapologetic. Hey, look, we let you ride this out long enough. In 2 weeks, we're going to reset you, and wherever you fall, that's where you're going to fall. Mm-hmm. And then there's other ones that are working with their clients to slowly get them off and basically saying, look, for the time being, I can keep you on, but it is happening. So it's something that we're tracking now to sort of get a sense for, look, who's being, who is being unfrozen, if you will, and being placed into the tier based on today's environment, which will then negatively impact many of them. And then it's a matter of coming up with, do you get the portfolio tier revenue qualifier reduced to allow for similar types of discounts, but based on less volume? Can you request for it to continue on a freeze? So far, that's the unknown, because they just, this isn't something that UPS has really even made public. When you bring it up, we've had some clients bring it up to their rep, and they say, well, where'd you get this information? So then we realize, okay, we may need to publish some information about this so that they have a reference point. So I guess the long answer to the short one is we really don't know how long it will be sustained, but we're seeing the initial efforts made to basically move companies off of that freeze. And of course, for them, it's a perfect environment to do so, because if they lose a couple of clients, they're not worried about it because they're already well beyond capacity. So their timing to do this is really beneficial to them. I would say it's not, how they go about doing so will be interesting. I would say the way that they handled rate increases for larger shippers was, I think, really, really wrong in many different ways. And we can get into that if you like. But for smaller shippers, they seem to have been a little more tolerant and forgiving. And we'll see how, what the effects are here.
Got it. Yeah, I know we have Will is back to ask this question, but maybe do you want to finish up that thought? Why that you think it was wrong to?
Yeah. So what we've seen with some larger shippers has been, the standard agreement has a 30-day out clause on both sides. But very often there's a penalty clause that comes with that, that the carrier can impose, which is a one-sided, maybe 2 or 3% penalty clause based on your last year's spend. What we saw UPS in particular do with some of the larger shippers was go in, raise their pricing by 20 or 30%, and basically give them a couple weeks to sign the agreement, telling them in 30 days you're going to list rates unless you sign this. And this occurred, let's say, ironically, mid-October-ish. So it aligns right with, this timeline. And of course, companies hadn't budgeted for this. And I would say pretty consistently between 20 and probably 35% increases. And when a company's spending $50 million, for example, and they're told, hey, your costs are going to go up $15 million, it's a pretty big hit. And this is before the actual rate increase gets applied, which of course can increase that number even further. And this happened with multiple clients that we've dealt with. So it's, I'm sure it's happened to many of them out there.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's not great.
No.
But we have Will's back. Will, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, two questions. First is if you could recommend regional carriers, like a source for regional carriers across the nation. And the second question is, if this continues, what do you see as a threat to the FedEx UPS stranglehold as far as disruption?
All right, I'll go ahead and take that. So there's not really a consolidate. So we'll take them in order. As far as the regional carriers, there's not necessarily a consolidated source just because of their regional nature. Although there's I've seen some really good articles dealing with them on, for example, on Parcel Magazine, has had some really good articles that break down the service areas. In fact, I think one was written by a guy named Thomas Anderson, but it breaks down the service areas of the regionals. It kind of highlights some of their highs and lows and the areas that they work in. And then some of the regionals actually have partnerships with other regionals that expand the geographic footprint that they can service. They are we believe pretty strongly in them, that they're a pretty good option. The only things to keep in mind with them is is technology constraints, right? Because every new carrier you introduce in your supply chain is going to have a different technology platform. It's going to have some different needs. But in general, we're pretty favorable on them. And especially in today's environment, they could provide an important safety valve to help with some of the volumes there. And then I'm sorry, what was the second question? I got too wrapped up in that one.
But as far as a disruption, if
Oh
UPS,
yeah.
FedEx continue, who's going to threaten their business?
That it's really interesting because, of course, the obvious answer is Amazon, but we don't know yet what Amazon's path is going to be. So, they've added 50 planes this year, and obviously they're growing their network out pretty significantly. But a lot of their solutions, for example, other deliveries, not their prime, but a lot of their other deliveries it's a crowdsource model on the delivery, which works great in population centers, but it's not a universal solution. So I think one of the big questions for Amazon is Amazon's end game to become a common carrier and compete directly with UPS and FedEx, or is their goal simply to deliver all their own packages? Now, of course, it will disrupt the market either way. If the Amazon goal is simply to grow out and deliver all their own packages, that's obviously a huge amount of volume that is not going to UPS and the post office, which is currently. And, one of the things, and of course, in hindsight, it looks genius, was, the FedEx decoupling with Amazon created some significant capacity just at the time when this market has grown so much, which has allowed them to, they shed packages from Amazon that maybe they were getting $4 for and are replacing those packages from other shippers that they might be getting $12 for. So it was a great move on FedEx's part, which created that capacity. So if Amazon only delivers their own packages, that's going to still create a lot of capacity in the UPS and post office network that they'll have to soak up somehow. So that would actually be terrific for the market, in my opinion, because it will create more competition, because UPS will shift from the yield management mode they're in now to a market share acquisition mode, which is beneficial to the market. Now, if Amazon does decide to become a common carrier and compete directly with UPS and FedEx, obviously it'll be interesting to see what happens with their relationship with UPS at that time. But it obviously would inject a new major player, which has been very hard to do. We saw DHL try and fail, and there's been some other attempts. But there's some very significant barriers to entry in the industry, capital investment. So if anyone can do it, it can be Amazon. But I think the answer to your question is it will be Amazon. The only question is exactly what that looks like. But either way, either more delivery of their own packages or moving into the market in general will definitely have an impact, and in my opinion, a positive one on the market in general.
Can I have one thought to that too?
Certainly.
Please do.
Yeah, the other thing I would consider here is, look, this was all unexpected. So there are a lot of people that are still sort of hunkering down at home. They're not comfortable. I think the latest statistic is maybe 60% of people are comfortable going to a store. And I'm sure that's in different capacity based on their level of comfort. So you still have a lot of people that are ordering when things let up, let's say sometime in 2021, although the way that we now approach e-commerce with people that wouldn't typically buy online now has basically since that has happened, that doesn't mean that this amount of demand for shipping is going to continue. So if we have an issue, and a lot of it ties back to your basic supply and demand, if there's an issue where someone's not going to get a product for 3 or 4 or 5 days, well, now, contrary to today, where they're not comfortable going to the store, they may just go to the store. So we're going to see there's going to be a downward shift in volume naturally as a result of people just getting back to somewhat of like a normal life. There's a joy to some of being able to actually go to a store and doing some of these things. So I think you'll see things settle into place. The other thing is we're not going to have the unexpected surge in the future, at least not in the immediate future, that we saw this year. So things, we're going to be able to plan better next time, or as things settle back into place. So you're not going to have, I don't think there'll be as much of an issue come sometime in January, February, as we're seeing today. And then, considering that the carriers are taking a lot of steps now to get through the holiday peak, they can keep those resources in place thereafter to the level that they need so they can sustain a pretty consistent model, at least until we reach the holidays next year. And of course, a lot of things can change before then. So although, I know that a lot of what we're talking about sounds like there's this major challenge. I think the major challenge is probably lasting for another 2 or 3 months, and then we're going to see things let up a bit. Again, capacity is going to open up a little bit. I think we'll be in a better position then, or most companies will be in a better position at that point.
Thanks. And we have another question that came in from Snezana. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. So I think you started touching on this, but in this current environment where it sounds like the carriers have all the negotiating leverage, if you were to differentiate between different retailers, maybe it's between soft lines and hard lines, maybe it's between the ones that have the more spread out brick and mortar inventory, what gives a retailer more versus less leverage right now in that negotiation? How would you categorize the retailers? Is there anyone that stands out as particularly at risk or with a particularly good hand? And then as you fast forward, what are the things that retailers control that can help increase their leverage? Is it relationships like Shipped or Best Buy's announcement with Instacart that, beyond a certain price, I'm just going to cut you out, carrier, and do it myself? Is it other things? Thanks.
Yeah, Ken, do you have a preference?
No, I'll go ahead and start, and then you can touch on whatever I miss. And that's a great question, by the way. So I think the carriers that have the most leverage now are the ones that, number one, have the most flexibility now, right? So if you started out having some volume with UPS, some with FedEx, some with the post office, some with the regional, that helps you because your options are larger and the carriers know your options are larger. The other thing, and I don't know how changeable this is, but the ones with the best leverage are the ones with the best packages. I mean, if you're shipping books, all the carriers want you, so you're going to have more leverage than someone that's shipping lampshades, right? So that the quality of the freight, so to speak, if it's small, dense freight, you're going to have more leverage than if you're shipping whiteboards or furniture or something the carriers don't want in their network. So having some leverage by having that flexibility of multiple carriers is helpful because, as Thomas mentioned earlier, when UPS or FedEx have come back, and we've mostly seen it on UPS, and insisted on the price increase, those have always been single shipper retailers, meaning they know they don't have an option, right? They know they can't easily move over to another shipper. So having that relief valve of multiple carriers would be very helpful. Having the ability to, or if you have good packages, that helps. And then again, I believe that diversified supply chain helps because if you can spread your shipments and your packages out over multiple buildings for the carrier, that helps them. If you're crushing one facility with volume, that's something they try to avoid. So, and Thomas, I'll let you add on to that, whatever you'd like.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, the chains that have locations throughout the U.S. in certain markets, if those guys aren't utilizing, a shipped solution, I think that is a major mistake. Even those that have a presence in a mall, for example, if someone may not want to go in, but they narrowed it down to a dress in 2 different sizes, to have that be brought to the person so they can try it on at home for the time being, and then return one, and it's a simple process. I think there's some of those things that are just not utilized currently that could be, and I think some companies are doing that, but there's certainly plenty that we run into that have a national presence, that have a chain type environment in local markets that could absolutely be benefiting from utilizing non-global carriers, and they choose not to. And again, I think technology is the biggest constraint, but those things can be overcome. And it's unfortunate to see those guys. I think they're going to fall behind. I think those guys have the biggest opportunity today. As for leverage, I think once we get into sometime in January and February, again, the opportunity to open up for an RFP for the services and getting the agreement that you want in place, which is maybe a 90-day out clause instead of 30 days, for example, and getting the right terms in there to benefit you, that I think that'll open up again. It's just not the environment today or over the next month.
That's great. Thank you. How, Thomas, you kind of raised an issue earlier. How are you advising the retailers to plan for next year? Presumably the volumes aren't going to be quite as high as this year, or do you think they will? That this is just this new level that we're at, and you have to kind of deal with 120 million shipments in December. Is that how are you guys talking to your clients these days and advising?
Yeah, I think they're often telling us, look, here's what we're going to do, and let's find some ways to make that happen. And at that point, it really is hard to predict. There's no way we could have predicted a year ago what we've seen now. But I do think next year will be easier to predict. Challenge that we have right now, I think, is more cost than anything else. Unexpected costs. We have one client in particular that's going to see about a 25% increase in their costs because of UPS and FedEx's new practice of applying additional handling fees to shipments where the length and girth exceed 105 inches, which, if you take a 2 cubic foot box, 24 by 24 by 24, that's about 120. So these are not really big boxes. Now, all of a sudden, they're going to take an additional $16 additional handling fee on top of the charges that already apply if they don't have a discount. So those, I think the cost component becomes a major issue, and how do you deal with that side of things? Once we get closer to next year, I think it'll be, I just think things will settle down a little bit where we're not going to see, it won't be as impactful next year as it has been this year.
And if I could add a little to that. So there's been a couple, I think, really kind of creative solutions that some of our customers are even talking about for next year. So one, of course, one of the obvious ones is just extending that shopping season. Like we saw Prime Day was in October this year. Just trying to get their customers to purchase earlier. Another thing is an attempt to move the inventory closer to their customers ahead of time, either through multiple DCs, or one thing we have a couple clients doing is they call them kind of staging areas or whatnot, where they're basically going into empty mall spaces and renting the space out and not using it as a retail space, but just a staging area for packages. So they're putting the inventory there in anticipation of needing the inventory in that area later during the peak, but it's allowing them to shorten the links in that supply chain. And one of the other ones that I think has been really fascinating to me has been, because we're moving the shopping season earlier, what does that do? That also pulls the returns earlier. And one thing shippers don't want to deal with is a large number of returns right in the middle of peak, right? Because if you're pushing people to purchase in October and November, those returns are going to come back in November and December. So we've had a couple of customers that we helped do an analysis on what makes sense as far as a return, meaning it may actually make more sense if it's a low dollar item to allow the customer to not return it and just keep it. Number one, the customer, it might make them feel better about the experience. But number two, you don't have to pay for the shipment back. You don't have to pay the labor to process the return on an item you may not be able to resell anyway. So either not accepting returns and just allowing the customer to keep it, or saying they will accept a return and will pay for shipping, but you have to return it after the holidays, to keep the burden of processing those returns out of their operation during peak.
Got it. Okay. You touched on something, Kenneth, that I actually was going to ask you about with these alternative fulfillment methods. And, you know, we hear a lot about micro fulfillment as well. Even yesterday, Lowe's talked about, you know, trying to free up space about 10,000 square feet in the back of their store, where they could then use that to prep for small parcel delivery effectively from the store. Um, are you, can you talk more about that? And like, do you think that will be effective? You know, like that, those dark staging areas as you talked about, or micro fulfillment out of the back of a Target, let's say, or a Walmart?
I do. I think there's a lot of advantages to that. There's some disadvantages too. So the advantage, of course, is the delivery. If and depending on how you do it, as Thomas mentioned, the shipped, you could start making same day deliveries if you're doing that,
Mhm.
or the cost of delivery would be significantly less because you're delivering it across town instead of across the country. Now, it also means you have to stage, and we've implemented the ship from store with a couple of our customers, and the hurdles there, of course, were training, right? Training the personnel on how to package and how to do it, making sure that the unboxing experience is consistent, whether the product comes from the fulfillment center or from the store, right? You don't want any degradation of the packaging or the way it's packed, depending on where it's coming from, and then having supplies at those locations. So those are the challenges, but the advantages really seem to outweigh it. And not only does it allow for that micro fulfillment, but it also lends itself to things like the curbside pickup and whatnot. And I've seen a lot of real creativity with things like the curbside pickup. I mean, we even have one customer that has boosted their point of sale through, so they're a clothing retailer, and when they come out to give you your package, they will wheel out a not quite a mannequin, but kind of a clothes rack with things that go with what you bought, in case you want to buy it right there.
Okay.
Right. So hey, this shirt and these shoes go with that jacket you bought. So there really is a lot of creativity out there in trying to do these things, which, because if you are doing the micro fulfillment or the pickup from store or the curbside pickup, it gives you a touch of the customer a little bit more than again, if the package is coming from a fulfillment center across the country.
Okay. I know we're getting close to our time here, guys. I have a couple of quick ones for you, though. Thomas, I'll go to you. How would you guys advise, you know, the people listening to the call, like if they wanted to dig in deeper with the retailers themselves or get more information about how, you know, who does this well? Like, are there metrics that you would look at, or can you look at, or do you, you know, from sort of an outsider's perspective? Like if I was going to talk to Target and say, hey, what are the questions I should be asking
Yeah,
about there?
you put me on the spot on that one.
Sorry.
No, I think, I mean, I can at least answer how we get to, which is just research.
Sure.
You know, I mean, we start digging, and once you find, you get information, then you dig based on that information, and it's amazing to see how much information truly is out there. Then you just have to consider the source of that information to see, you know, how maybe how accurate it is. But I, you know, and Kenneth may have a better answer than me, but I would say that's how, you know, the benefit we have, of course, is working firsthand with many shippers. So, you know, we learn that way. And then,
Right.
obviously, if it's someone different, then I mean, it's still looking at some of these, like a Target, for example, who we don't have a relationship with, in that capacity, at least, where we can then, you know, you do your research and sort of see, and sometimes even see firsthand, right? It's, you know, when you experience some of these things, it prompts you to think, look, it's, you know, in Kenneth, in my case, this is what we're sort of truly passionate about, you know, where other people probably think it's interesting to do something that's a little more, you know, truly interesting. You know, we think shipping it's like, that's pretty sexy to us, you know? So, the reality is we might find more interest in that than the average person.
Got it. So, all right, Kenneth, in the past, you guys have told us, or you're given us your view of like what shipping rate increases there might be in the coming 6 months or coming year. Sitting here today, given the crazy surge we've had, do you think 2021 is going to be the more normal 5 to 7% rate increase, or how are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, good question, and that's one we get all the time. So, So, the carriers have announced their basic 4.9% rate increase for base charges for 2021. Although, as you know from our past conversations, that's only limited to the base rates and doesn't include things like the accessorial fees, the way some of those accessorial fees are calculated and assessed. So I think kind of for an average shipper, whatever really that is, it's probably more like 8 to 9%. But as Thomas mentioned, if you fall into certain buckets, if you ship primarily during peak, if you have large or exceptionally heavy packages, anything that kind of falls out of their norm, it could be significantly more than that. As he mentioned, we've seen some folks taking 20, 25, 30% increases and they haven't even hit the rate increase yet. But I would, it's always best to take a case by case on that because everybody has different characteristics. The trap people fall in is they say, oh, it's a 4.9%. They take their budget for this year, they add 4.9%, and they think that's what they'll pay next year. I would, on a very conservative basis, plan on 8 to 9, but it could very well be up in the double digits.
Okay. Do you guys is there an average price per package? I assume, I know that there's some that are very heavy, there's furniture, but like for the average, is it like, does it cost the retailer $4 to ship, $5 to ship, or is it like $8 or $9 to ship,
Yeah. And there's not really an average because there's service levels and weights and zones and different accessorial fees. But I mean, an average package these days would be more like $10 or $12. And that'd be a light one. That's a light one going locally. It's not unusual to have average package costs in the $25 and $30 range.
Wow. Okay. And then Thomas, you may get the last word here, but and Kenneth, you can share your thoughts too, actually. But I'll start with Thomas. Are there any big trends or themes that we should be thinking about, or maybe that you guys are thinking about for heading into 2021 that will be we'll have to deal with for next year?
I think in terms of kind of just address some of that, we've definitely seen a shift. If we go back 5 to 10 years, the increases that were being applied were really targeting e-commerce shipments, where there's a residential component. And what we've seen, I would say in the last 2 or 3 years, has been, that's still relevant, but there's been this shift to really increasing the charges for shipments that are originally fairly large. And now we go back, quite a few years where anything within 3 cubic feet was exempt from dimensional weight altogether. And then it became additional handling changed from 60 inches long down to 48. A year ago, we saw it go again, additional handling being applied to shipments that are 50 pounds and greater instead of 70 pounds and greater. This, now going into next year, we're seeing the length and girth being 105, which, is really, I mean, we're getting into what we would consider fairly reasonable sized boxes now getting hefty penalties. And it's important to know all these are negotiable, but again, it forces someone to really keep track and know what's happening and budgeting for it, and then understanding what element of this is negotiable and to what level, and do I have to open up an RFP? So I think that's certainly something to consider. I think the other part is the fact that e-commerce behavior has jumped so significantly, whether it's 5, 6, 7 years ahead. I do think volume is going to be up substantially in 2021, but I don't think we have to be. We shouldn't lose any sleep over it. I think it's still manageable once we get through the next couple of weeks. I mean, December is not going to look pretty, no doubt about it. There's going to be beyond capacity on several days, and things are just going to get bumped, and there will be shipments that don't arrive in time based on when people expect that to happen. And I think you'll see a lot of complaints thereafter. But I think once we get into January, things will just get a little more normal. And then as we progress and hopefully get through this whole situation, hopefully things get a little bit more normal in time for the holiday peak next year, which would be the next real potential storm, but there is time to prepare for that. And I mean, I think there are a lot of things that a lot of companies can do. the challenge, I think, is again what Ken had mentioned. If you have a single distribution center, your hands are certainly more tied than someone with multiple multiple distribution centers and or in areas where there is a regional carrier, for example.
Got it. Got it. Anything you want to add to that, Kenneth? Otherwise, I think we're
No, I think that summed it up perfectly.
perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you guys for doing this. We appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who's been participating. If anybody has more questions out there, let us know. We can, hook you guys up with Thomas and Kenneth. But as always, very informative, very helpful call, guys. We really appreciate it. We hope everybody has a great holiday season, and we look forward to the next time we get to do this with you guys. So thanks so much.
Thank you.